When the cold winds of 1942 swept across the vast and unforgiving plains of the Eastern Front, both armies believed they understood the nature of war, its machines, its limits, its predictable brutal rhythm. But all of that changed the moment the Soviet T-34 rolled out of the forests and into the stunned gaze of German soldiers who had been taught to think of Soviet industry as primitive and outdated. Because as the first shells clanged uselessly against its sloped armor, ringing out like fists, striking a cathedral bell, panic rippled through German lines in a way no Allied weapon had ever produced, and in headquarters far behind the front, officers stared at fragmented radio reports with tightening jaws, unable to process how a machine built by peasants, as they arrogantly called them, could move with such unnatural speed across mud and snow, crushing frozen earth beneath its wide tracks, its turret pivoting with predatory calm as it fired round after round that tore through Panzer IIIs and IVs as though their armor were nothing more than paper. And as these alarming reports accumulated, some claiming entire companies being wiped out by only a handful of the mysterious Soviet tanks, General Heinz Guderian himself leaned over the cartographic table late into the night, listening to trembling field commanders explain how their formations were collapsing, not from numbers, but from shock, from disbelief, from the dawning understanding that the Reich had been deceived by its own propaganda. And when these messages finally reached the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's isolated forest headquarters, he erupted into a fury so intense that even hardened officers stood silent, watching him slam his fists against the oak table as he shouted, "Impossible! Our panzers are the finest in the world!" Yet even as he raged, the truth seeped into the room like smoke. The T-34, with its sloped armor angled so brilliantly that it increased effective thickness without adding weight, was something German designers had arrogantly dismissed decades earlier, and now their mistake was costing them thousands of lives, because every bounced shell, every destroyed panzer, every retreating battalion whispered the same humiliating truth. Germany had been out-engineered, outthought, outprepared, and as Hitler paced in mounting panic, demanding answers from his astonished generals, the front lines descended into chaos where German crews, once confident, almost smug in their superiority, found themselves facing a machine that moved like a predator through terrain that bogged down their own vehicles, its diesel engine refusing to stall even in deep mud where Panzer engines choked, its wide tracks gliding over swamps and snowbanks that swallowed German armor whole, and young Panzer gunners, their hands trembling as they loaded shell after shell, watched in horror as their rounds ricocheted from the T-34 in sparks, each failed shot a death sentence. Because the Soviet tank always responded with brutal precision, its 76mm gun firing with such force that German tank commanders often couldn't even see where the shot came from before their world erupted in flame. And as smoke rose across the steppes, German soldiers began telling stories, half-whispered, half-superstitious, of invincible Soviet machines born from the factories of the Urals, machines that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike without hesitation, then disappear into the haze of snow and gunpowder, leaving behind burning metal and shattered morale. And while the Wehrmacht struggled to reorganize, Soviet crews, hardened by years of brutal training and fueled by rage over the invasion of their homeland, bonded with their T-34s as if they were living beasts, trusting their armor, trusting their mobility, trusting that this new machine finally gave them a weapon that could stand against the German war machine that had crushed Europe. And so, as more T-34s rolled westward, the Germans, who had built their war strategy around the assumption of armored superiority, now found their doctrine collapsing, their advances slowing. Their commanders terrified to face an enemy that did not fight the way they had expected, and Hitler, hearing report after report of panzer units overrun, demanded immediate solutions, screaming at his designers, "How can peasants build a tank better than ours? How did we let this happen?" While his engineers exchanged uneasy glances, knowing the answer but fearing to speak it, that Germany had underestimated the Soviets, underestimated their factories, underestimated their innovation, and while Germany poured resources into complex, expensive machines that required perfect conditions to operate, the Soviets built the T-34 simple, strong, deadly, and in numbers that dwarfed anything German production could hope to match. And as panic spread through the highest ranks of the Reich, Hitler ordered the creation of a Super tank. A new machine that would restore dominance. The Panther. But even this order came too late, because the Eastern Front was transforming into a graveyard of German armor, each destroyed Panzer a grim reminder that the T-34 had rewritten the laws of tank warfare, and as winter deepened, German troops found themselves crushed beneath a weapon they never imagined would exist, a weapon that made Hitler pace the corridors of his bunker at night, muttering to himself, wondering how his war, his carefully crafted vision of blitzkrieg, had been undone by a tank forged in the heart of Soviet industry, and though he refused to admit it publicly, every general who stood in those strategy meetings saw the fear in his eyes, fear not of Soviet soldiers, but of the machine that now haunted his dreams, the T-34. Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight and or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. As the brutal winter of 1942 tightened its icy grip across the Eastern Front, the panic Hitler felt inside the wolf's lair began to seep outward into every corner of the German command structure, because while he raged behind closed doors, the men actually facing the T-34s were watching their long-held tactical doctrines crumble in real time, and they knew something their leadership refused to accept. That the Soviets were adapting faster than the Germans, learning from each engagement, refining their tank formations, coordinating armor with infantry and artillery in ways Germany had once pioneered, and now those very tactics were being used against the Reich with terrifying effectiveness, and on the front lines, German tank crews who had once joked about the incompetence of Soviet engineers now found themselves whispering prayers before turning the ignition, knowing that every sunrise brought another clash with a machine that seemed to glide through the snow like a steel wolf, and young Soviet crews, many barely out of their teenage years, pushed their T-34s with fierce determination, encouraged by political officers who told them that each burning German tank was an act of patriotism, each destroyed Panzer proof that the invasion could be reversed, and so the T-34 did not merely fight, it inspired, emboldened, transformed the morale of the Red Army. And in the vast frozen expanses stretching from Kursk to Stalingrad, the sound of its engine became the heartbeat of the counteroffensive, rumbling through valleys and across open plains where German formations once advanced with unstoppable precision, but now found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy tank that could cross ditches, ford rivers, and smash through obstacles their own machines could not overcome, and German commanders tried desperately to adjust, modifying ambush tactics, positioning anti-tank guns at steeper angles, attempting flanking maneuvers, but each adaptation met the same fate. The T-34's sloped armor deflected shots that should have killed it, its tracks shrugged off terrain that immobilized panzers, and its guns struck with devastating power at ranges that forced Germans to expose themselves for a chance to retaliate, and this imbalance placed crushing pressure on German logistics, forcing them to move their heavier, more complex tanks into the theater, machines like the Panzer IV F2 and later variants. But these incremental adjustments were mere bandages on a wound that grew wider with every engagement, and Hitler's fury grew in tandem, driving him deeper into obsession as he demanded the Panther tank be built, insisting it must not only counter the T-34 but surpass it in every way, and German engineers scrambled under impossible deadlines, rushing prototypes to the front before they were ready, resulting in breakdowns, engine fires, and mechanical failures that only widened the gap between German ambition and battlefield reality. Because the Panther, brilliant on paper, was too delicate for the harsh terrain of the Eastern Front, too complex for the overstretched supply lines, too late to restore the supremacy Hitler believed was his divine right, and while the Reich funneled precious steel and fuel into this new machine, Soviet factories in the Urals were operating day and night, protected from air raids, producing T-34s at a rate that dwarfed German output, sending waves of these steel beasts westward until even veteran German tank aces, men who had once believed themselves invincible, began to realize they were being swallowed by sheer numbers and overwhelming adaptability, and as spring melted into summer, the Eastern Front became a living canvas of chaos, where German units reported entire battalions of T-34s appearing over the horizon like a dark tide, their silhouettes shimmering through heat waves rising from the ground, and commanders tried desperately to reposition anti-tank guns and artillery. But the T-34s moved too fast, sweeping across flanks, flanking entrenched German positions with frightening efficiency, and at night, when the battlefield quieted, German soldiers could still hear the metallic growl of T-34 engines echoing across the darkness, a constant reminder that the enemy had achieved something Germany believed only it was capable of: technological dominance. While, deep in the wolf's lair, Hitler began isolating himself further, berating his generals for their failures, refusing to believe their reports, insisting that the T-34's success was exaggerated, a lie, a trick, because accepting its superiority meant admitting that his war strategy, the very foundation of blitzkrieg, was flawed, and that thought tormented him, driving him into fits of rage that shook the walls of his bunker. And the more unhinged he became, the clearer it was to his inner circle that Hitler feared the T-34 not simply as a machine but as a symbol of everything he had underestimated: Soviet resilience, Soviet industry, Soviet innovation, and on the battlefield, the effects of this fear manifested in desperate orders, hastily planned offensives, misallocated resources, and increasingly unrealistic expectations placed on exhausted German troops, while Soviet commanders, sensing the shift in momentum, pressed harder, pushing wave after wave of T-34s into key sectors, shattering defensive lines that once stood firm, and with each breakthrough, German soldiers began abandoning their belief in invincibility, replacing it with a creeping, bitter understanding that their enemy had surpassed them in a way no one anticipated, and as both sides bled across hundreds of miles of frozen earth and burning fields, the T-34 became more than a tank. It became the instrument that fractured the myth of German superiority, the machine that shattered the confidence of Hitler's generals, and the unstoppable force that pushed the Eastern Front inexorably toward a turning point the world would remember forever. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. As 1943 bled into the pivotal battles of 1944, the echo of Stalin's factories thundered across the Eastern Front, sending wave after wave of T-34s into Germany's tightening stranglehold, and what had begun as a terrifying surprise for Hitler evolved into a catastrophic realization, because every frontline report arriving on his desk confirmed the same grim truth. The T-34 was no longer just a battlefield threat, it was a strategic disaster for the Reich, a machine that Germany could neither match in quantity nor neutralize in quality, and as Soviet tank crews grew more confident, more disciplined, more synchronized with infantry and artillery, the Germans found themselves trapped in a cruel imbalance where every destroyed T-34 was replaced by two more, while every destroyed Panther or Tiger represented resources the Reich could no longer afford to lose. And the strain on German logistics became unbearable as fuel shortages crippled armored divisions, spare parts vanished from supply depots, and maintenance crews worked under impossible pressure to keep aging machines running, while Soviet engineers simplified the T-34 design even further, reducing manufacturing time, improving reliability, and turning the tank into something almost mythic, an unstoppable steel river flowing westward, reclaiming land Germany had once consumed with fire and lightning. And the psychological toll on German soldiers was immense, because even the most decorated tank aces, the men who had carved their reputations during the sweeping victories of 1940 and 1941, now found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to break, its tanks rolling through artillery barrages, navigating minefields, and emerging from forests in numbers that seemed endless, and the Germans, once masters of mechanized warfare, were forced into increasingly defensive operations, retreating from villages they had captured at tremendous cost, watching the Soviet flag rise where the swastika once flew, and each retreat fed the growing sense of dread inside Hitler's headquarters, where he paced endlessly, ranting about betrayal, incompetence, and fate, numbing himself to reality with delusions of miracle weapons that would somehow turn the tide. But those miracle weapons never arrived, and the Eastern Front continued to collapse, accelerated by the T-34's brutal efficiency, and on the battlefield, German commanders attempted counterattacks using their prized Panther tanks, hoping their superior firepower would finally check the Soviet advance, but the harsh truth emerged again and again: the Panthers, though formidable, were too few, too fragile, and too late, breaking down in mud, freezing in winter, overheating in summer, and requiring maintenance teams Germany no longer had, while the T-34s pressed forward with relentless momentum, shrugging off the terrain that crippled German armor. Their crews hardened by years of brutal fighting, their tactics refined by commanders who had learned exactly how to exploit German weaknesses. And at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history, the T-34 cemented its legend, swarming over German positions in a tidal wave of steel, outnumbering, outmaneuvering, and ultimately overwhelming the very Panzer divisions that Hitler once believed would conquer the world, and the defeat at Kursk shattered the last illusions of German armored superiority, marking the moment when the Reich's fate was sealed, even if Hitler refused to accept it, because from that point forward, the war in the East became a relentless Soviet march toward Berlin, with T-34s rumbling through liberated villages, crossing rivers on improvised bridges, and grinding over the ruins of German defensive lines, while behind them, Soviet infantry and artillery pressed harder, driving the Wehrmacht back mile by mile. And civilians across Eastern Europe watched the T-34s pass like symbols of deliverance, or vengeance, depending on their experiences under German occupation. And as the Soviets pushed deeper into Poland, Belarus, and the Baltic states, the desperation inside German command reached its peak, with Hitler issuing increasingly irrational orders, demanding that divisions fight to the last man, refusing strategic withdrawals, and lashing out at his generals for failures caused not by cowardice but by the cold, immovable reality of Soviet industrial might, embodied perfectly in the T-34, and when the Red Army finally crossed the Oder River in early 1945. The sound of T-34 engines echoed all the way to Berlin, where Hitler, now a trembling shadow of the dictator who once claimed destiny itself, was on his side, listened to reports that Soviet armor was less than 100 kilometers from the capital, and though he clung to fantasies of counterattacks that would never materialize, even his closest advisors knew the truth. The unstoppable Soviet advance was powered by a machine Hitler had underestimated from the moment it appeared, a machine he had once mocked as crude, primitive, and unworthy of German attention, yet now that same machine was closing in on his bunker, its tracks grinding over the shattered remains of his ambitions, its presence a final reminder of how completely he had misjudged his enemy. And when T-34s finally entered the outskirts of Berlin in April 1945, rumbling past burned-out buildings, overturned vehicles, and desperate German defenders, they marked the end of the war Hitler himself had unleashed, the end of the empire he claimed would last 1,000 years, and the end of the myth of German invincibility, because the machine he once dismissed had become the symbol of his downfall. And as Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag, sealing the fate of the Third Reich, the T-34 stood silently in the streets below, its armor scarred, its paint scorched, its tracks coated in dust and rubble, but undefeated, unbroken, and forever immortalized as the tank that made Hitler panic, the tank that reshaped the Eastern Front, and the tank that helped end one of the darkest chapters in human history. Comment below, what part of this story hit you the most? Thank you for watching this chapter of history all the way to the end.